Welcome everyone. It's great to see so many people here. My name is Matthew Wicks. I'm Head of Outreach and Training at Beyond Autism. Start off with a few of the housekeeping things. Let us know where you're listening from today in the chat. That'd be really good. Any questions, again, put those in the chat. If we've got time for them at the end, I'll be able to answer them live. If not, I'm more than happy to email people back with answers to the questions. So yeah, please do ask if you've got anything. So today I'm going to be talking about positive behaviour support, a school-wide model. Without further ado, let's get started. So today we're going to cover, starting off with what PBS is. We're going to look at the evidence base for PBS in schools. We're then going to have a look at what school-wide PBS is. And finally, we're going to finish with a case study of the work that Beyond Autism did with Dysart School. So we'll start with behaviour analysis. How do we use behaviour analysis at Beyond Autism? Practice guided by behaviour analysis is a teaching approach that takes the scientific principles of learning and behaviour and it applies them in practice to teach important skills, personalised to an individual. It can also be used to help reduce behaviours that challenge or behaviours that limit opportunities by teaching functional alternatives. Behaviour analysis helps us to understand how learning takes place and how behaviour can be affected by the environment. So that's behaviour analysis. What's PBS, positive behaviour support? PBS is a multi-component framework for understanding behaviours that challenge. It falls under the umbrella of behaviour analysis, and some of the key features are that it's about improving quality of life. It has a focus on values, respect, and dignity. It's all about seeking better ways to get a learner's needs met. Everything in PBS is data-based. Decisions made are based on the data. And overall, it's also looking at systems and culture change. So from those key features, quality of life is probably the most important one. It's all about improving quality of life for the individual and the people around them. PBS supports people to live a life with meaningful and interesting activities and the opportunity to learn new skills. And that's in line with our vision at Beyond Autism. We want to ensure that autistic children and young adults access an education which empowers a life full of choice, independence, and opportunity. So when we talk about PBS and school-wide PBS, we look back to the work of Peter McGill from the University of Kent, and he discusses this concept of capable environments. So McGill says that behaviours that challenge can lead to a breakdown in placement, use of restrictive practices, and the removal of individuals to costly out-of-borough placements. As Carr in 2007 stated, the central independent variable in PBS is systems change. So by making more capable environments, behaviours that challenge are reduced and quality of life is improved. Now McGill splits these capable environments into 12 different characteristics. So we're just going to go through each of them now and kind of explain a little bit more about what they mean. So we start with positive social interactions, and that's about the caregivers in those settings, liking the people that they're working with, interacting with them frequently. Next, we've got support for communication. So are the caregivers and teachers communicating in a way that the young person understands, and is also knowledge of that person's communication being shared. Next, we have support for participation in meaningful activity. This is about tailoring assistance in the preferred domestic, leisure, and work activities for that young person. And then provision of consistent and predictable environments which honour personalised routines and activities. So is the experience for the individual in the setting, whatever that setting might be, is it similar for them no matter who is supporting them? Next, we've got support to establish and or maintain friendships with family and friends. We have provision of opportunities for choice, and it's really clear with that one that we're making sure that the individual has that choice themselves as well. They're able to make the choice and they be involved in those decisions. We have encouragement of more independent functioning. So supporting that learner to learn new skills. And personal care and health support. Are the people working in that setting attentive to the individual's needs? Provision of acceptable physical environment. So we want to consider the sensory preference of the individuals there. What's the noise like? What's the lighting? Is it in a good state of repair? We've got mindful, skilled carers. We want to know that the carers are understanding, that they understand the reasons for behaviours that challenge and why they're happening. Effective management and support. Do the managers understand capable environments? It comes from the top down. And then finally, of the characteristics of capable environments, effective organisational context. Is there a general understanding of behaviours that challenge? Do individuals work there recognise the need to ensure safety of the individuals that they're caring for, and also those that are doing the caring? So we also want to think about the evidence for PBS in schools. What's the evidence base? Beckeraj in et al. 2021 conducted a systematic review of positive behavioural supports for children and young adults with developmental disabilities in special education settings. Overall, they found that of the 30 studies included in the systematic review, 28 of them demonstrated significant decreases in behaviours that challenge and also increases in alternative behaviours. They focused on the components of positive behaviour support as one of the measures of the studies that were included in the systematic review. And those components are split into 3 areas. You've got values, systems, and science and technologies. So when we look at these 3 areas, starting with values, it's about having a proactive and constructional approach. And what that means is what things are being added, skills are being taught, and we're not using punitive approaches. When we think about systems, we're talking about having a supportive context and environment. How do those aspects of the environment lead to an improvement in behaviour? And then finally, science and technology. It's about understanding the functions of behaviour. So PBS, like the larger umbrella of behaviour analysis, is scientific. We don't just try things and hope for the best. There's an evidence base that we can go back to. There's a science that underpins what we're doing. We can use that to put things in place and make the right decisions. So those components guide the approach of school-wide positive behaviour support, and they should be visible in all interventions. Some further evidence for PBS in schools. Park et al., 2019, the implementation of a school-wide positive behaviour support in 6 special schools in South Korea. What they found was there were positive outcomes in terms of the behaviour of the students, but also importantly, there were positive outcomes in terms of the perceptions of the efficacy of the approach and the classroom management skills for teachers. So you can see it's about the whole system, not just one aspect of that. So that's some of the evidence for PBS itself, or PBS as a framework. But what is school-wide PBS? So a lot of this was basically started from the work of George Sugai, who is a behaviour analyst based in America. And he developed what's called the PBIS, or Positive Behavioural Interventions and Supports. And at its core, it's a tiered framework for supporting students' behavioural, academic, social, emotional, and mental health. The key features of this approach are a combination of systems, data, and practices with an overarching focus on culture and equity. And then the ultimate goal is to improve learner outcomes. And really that's what we're always looking for. So some more detail on what it means by that tiered support. Positive behaviour support in schools, or school-wide PBS, looks at breaking down the individual learners within a setting, within a school, into these 3 tiers. So you start with tier 1 at the bottom, and that's going to be for the majority. It's going to be for all students, and it's the universal support, so the things that are available within that school for all learners. And then you move up to tier 2, which is for some of the learners. And that's about having targeted support for those that need a bit extra than what they can get from the universal supports. And then finally, for a few of the learners in the setting, there's going to be some that require that intensive and individualized support. And that's how we break those things down into the 3 tiers. And over the last 20 years, that approach has been introduced in over 25,000 schools in the US. It's not something that's as well known here in the UK. And that's obviously when we move on to talking about the case study, it's the work we've done here. So, perfect time to talk about our case study. This is about the work that Beyond Autism, our outreach team, have done at Dysart School, which is based in Surbiton, southwest London. We've had involvement with the school since 2020. There were some limits in the scope initially, down to the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously not being able to get into school, not as many students in, and all of those issues that we all know well. Over the last 3 years, the input has increased in scope and frequency of visits. So when I was looking back at the work we did at Dysart and trying to kind of formulate the processes that we went through, I split it into 3 phases. So if we start with phase 1, what was done initially? One of the first things was setting up the mental health and wellbeing plus meetings. So these were set up to meet the needs of the learners with additional needs that didn't meet CAMS thresholds. Attending the meetings would be the head teacher, the assistant head, who's also the mental health lead of the school, educational psychologist, members of the clinical team from CAMS, and also the behaviour analyst from Beyond Autism. So you can see it's a real interdisciplinary team approach to this, setting up those regular meetings to be able to discuss the most at-need students at the time, make sure that they were getting the right support that they needed from school, like I said, if they didn't quite meet those CAMS thresholds, but maybe they could have extra support within the school. Another aspect of phase one was looking at minimum classroom standards. That's things like the use of daily schedules, supporting students' communication, and use of things like the zones of regulation for supporting emotional regulation. The list of minimum classroom standards is much more extensive, and I'm more than happy to share things like that afterwards. If anyone's interested, you can drop us an email, put a question in the chat, and we can share some of those after. The other aspect of phase one was identifying some early years red flag behaviours. So what the behaviours that would indicate that for a learner in the early years, if they're starting to display those behaviours, that's kind of a key indicator that later on more support would be needed and there would potentially be more behaviours that challenge. Those sort of red flag behaviours were things like not making progress with establishing communication systems, or maybe rejection of existing systems for communication. Behaviours that challenge related to demands in the environment, new self-injurious behaviour, avoidance of social interactions, and also if staff notices that transitions are regularly physically supported, or visual supports are quite elaborate and hard to maintain. So those aspects of phase one were the initial things that were put in place, and that really started off on that journey of having this school-wide positive behaviour support. We then moved into phase two, and really all that entailed was an increase in input from the behaviour analysts, so from Beyond Autism. We attended the monthly Mental Health and Wellbeing Plus meetings, but then on top of that, there was bi-weekly in-class observations and feedback with class teams. And that was identified within the Mental Health and Wellbeing Plus meetings, where would be the sort of the priority, what classes to focus on. And that work was done more within the individual classes, having that feedback with the class teams at the end of the day, working on things through the day. We then moved on to phase three, which I guess can kind of be looked at in terms of having a bit more of a focused approach and really establishing some of those key features of school-wide PBS. The main part of that being the tiered system of support. So that was working really closely with the assistant head, mental health lead, looking at all the students in the school and identifying what tiers they would be in, what level of support they would need. And something that's really important to talk about here is that when we talk about a tiered system or having tiers within a school, we go back to thinking about that culture and culture change. And it's really important about the language we use when we're talking to all staff and getting them to understand that there's like a slight change in how we're approaching things. And we don't talk about a student being a tier 1 student or a tier 2 student. It's just a student that is currently benefiting from tier 1 support or tier 2 support. Because there's no reason why students wouldn't move through these tiers if we get their support right and things are going well, they're getting their needs met, they're not engaging in those high levels of behaviours that challenge, then they're not necessarily going to stay within a tier 3, they might come down to a tier 2. Equally, someone that's a tier 1, receiving tier 1 support, things can change. They might then have an increase in behaviours that challenge and suddenly they require some tier 2 support. But it's all about thinking about what support we're putting in and not labelling the individual. And that language seems like sometimes like a small thing, but it's really important in establishing those cultural changes within a system. So for learners receiving tier 1 support, they had what Dysart called an essentials toolkit, and that would be a document that would explain all the things about their communication, their own needs, and what they get from the universal support. Those learners that required a bit more than that, tier 2 support, would have additional input from the in-house PBS team, And the in-house PBS team are specialist teachers, the head teacher, assistant heads, and also the wellbeing practitioners. So they would be able to come in, work with the class team and give that additional support. And then finally, the tier 3 support provided to some of the students would be a behaviour support plan written by the behaviour analyst. And that's where Beyond Autism's input really comes in, that direct work with those students requiring them the highest level of support. Another key feature, as we mentioned earlier, robust data systems. It's really important. PBS, behaviour analysis, is a science. We want to make sure we're taking robust data, and that would take the form of ABC data. So when we're conducting our functional behavioural assessments, and also for the tier 2 students receiving that tier 2 support, they'll be taking ABC data, building up that evidence base. We can see what's happening, trying to find out the functions of the behaviour. There'll be functional assessment interviews conducted with family members and staff that know the students well, and also ongoing partial interval data. And that's a way of recording what's happening on a day-to-day basis. So once the behaviour plan's in place, we can see, is the behaviour plan working? If it's not quite working, we can make adjustments. But we're always going back to the data and having that evidence-based approach. So in terms of the sort of conclusions or outcomes, before our input, a student had been suspended from school. Since we've had our input, there hasn't been any further suspensions or exclusions. There is, however, a lot still to be learned. Systems that need to be established, which can be tricky. Interventions of this scale are not quick and easy. Like we said, things like culture change, it can take time. It really helps if you've got buy-in from all staff, especially staff at the top, who can facilitate that kind of trickle down and dissemination of the culture and the understanding of behaviour as a challenge and what we're trying to do. But despite those difficulties, the outcomes are worth it. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. If there's any questions, please do ask. Like I said, if you think of something afterwards, you want to send an email, please do. Or if you put it in the chat and we don't get a chance to get around to it, then I'd happily email answers. So we've had a couple of questions. So someone said, is this work affordable in mainstream schools? Is there evidence of cost benefit to back this? I think in terms of the actual evidence, it's definitely from the US, there's a lot of evidence. Like I said, with the work of George Guide, 25,000 schools, but that's the US, that's not the UK. So that's something that we do need to build up that evidence base, I think. There's, to my knowledge, not so many kind of schools that necessarily have the most robust system of SWPBS in place already. But it's definitely something we need to look at, and I think you can extract the evidence from other environments and use that to back it up. There is a lot of evidence for PBS and behaviour analysis working on individual levels and in terms of improving behaviour. Whether it's that specific cost benefit, that's something that we need to look more into. There's definitely some of that benefit as well to like the individual learners. So if we're seeing that improvement in their behaviour, it sometimes doesn't always quite match up with the, like a monetary value. But going back to the things like we talked about at the beginning, the quality of life being a really key measure of PBS, that's something that Beyond Autism, and especially in our outreach team, that we're trying to make sure we're really demonstrating that. What is the what is the quality of life before an intervention, afterwards, how are we demonstrating those improvements. Okay, like I said, please do email if there's questions. Our next session is building strategies for resilience. That's going to be on Friday, the 24th of November at 12:30. We'd really love it if you found the webinar useful. Please send us feedback. There's a QR code on the screen. We will also, when we email out the information, there'll be a link there that you can click on and leave us some feedback. Really do appreciate any feedback we get. And also, if you can consider a small donation, that would be great. But really, all that's left for me to say is thank you so much, and please do reach out if you have any further questions.